Beast, a story by user Jake the Snake Bake Cake. Chapter 2.
I can't believe how strong it is,
Siza sang as they rode in the private elevator back to orbit.
It broke the synthetic cuffs with such a sudden burst of strength, they didn't have time to stretch and absorb the blow.
Siza looked to her mother with a grin in his song.
How did you know this creature would be so amazing? It didn't display anything of value at all during the showing.
The young alien was just beginning to reach the prime of his song, and the voice fluttered in octaves as he spoke.
Because she is the best beast tamer this side of the rings, you off-tuned dolt.
The voice of his elder sister resonated in reply. She always knows which ones are the best.
I doubt it even is that strong, though. I'm sure, were Father here, he could have brought it to the ground without even using the collar.
Silence, Sonat! The voice rang out clear through the air in the rising elevator. Through the windows, the sky was beginning to darken, and the clouds were fading as they rode out of the atmosphere. Ytale's eyes blinked as she stared out at the stars coming into view, and at her own reflection. She met her own gaze in confidence. I simply chose the one which looked the most tameable. I believe I chose correctly. Even with its apparent strength, it failed to kill even a single guard during its walk to service.
I suppose that is true.
Siza turned to stare at the unconscious beast laying on the gravity trolley. Its skin seemed to have a tannish tinge, which mixed with an almost pink or red color in some places, and though hair covered its head and some of its face, the rest of its body was touched only lightly by it. That was, for the exception of its legs, which were partly covered by some strange interwoven hair or fabric.
It's quite strange looking, too,
he muttered quietly. It will do for what we need. It just has to look dangerous, Ytale muttered, her voice singing out in a low and dissonant tune.
If your father were here indeed.
The children had lost their father during a taming session of the previous ship guardian, and though they had killed the beast before it could wreak havoc, she had vowed never to put her children or her crew in harm's way again. Tradition was trading ships were to have a guardian beast, but in this section of space it was rare that any rogue ship would attempt a boarding, so the role could be filled by harmless mascots instead of fiercer predators. To fill the role, she had intentionally chosen the most docile of the creatures she'd seen. But now worry ate at her. The strange beast had broken the synthetic cuff material with ease, and withstood more snare rounds than any beast in recent memory. Then there was the matter of how it landed upon its release from its cage, with such ease. Such a strange creature she had encountered. But it seemed calm enough. None of its movements had been sudden, and she had to admit that for the amount of credits she'd bid for it, she was stuck with it. With a hum of irritation, she took thoughts off of the beast and placed them upon her ship, which was quickly approaching their view from the elevator. Ytale had paid extra to be certain their vessel could take off on her signal and prepare for deep travel. It had probably been worth it just for the sake of bravado. Appearances were everything when it came to the guild, and she had to appear strong. They had a long trade route to go, and she knew that if they failed to bring in a profit, this was the last journey she could afford. They had to make this count. Unbeknownst to the human, his entry into the trade ship had been anything but simple. His body had been sent through the decontamination bay after it had been decided that his odor of sweat and pain was unseemly. Protocol had dictated the series of nanobot cleansers issued to remove potential pathogens from his system, and an intense burst of ultraviolet radiation had been applied to his skin. It had not been realized that the human immune system tagged those nanobots as a threat, and had literally eaten the things alive before they managed to remove everything. Luckily, they had targeted the most dangerous of the microorganisms first, or the safety of the crew may have been in serious jeopardy. Human immunity did not extend to others, and any number of diseases the man contained would likely have caused a ship-wide epidemic. When he woke with pain. He also awoke with hunger. As the man rose, he felt the collar on his neck like you feel a limb that has fallen asleep. Tiny tingles and nothing more. He yawned and noticed that he was naked. Naked as the day he was born. To his right, he had found that they had left him his shorts. They were far more faded and worn than he had remembered. Evidence of the multi-stage cleaning he had unconsciously endured. The man knew none of this. In fact, he was only aware that his body felt light and clean. Beyond the background of a throbbing pain in the back of his skull and the constant pressure of the strange collar sealed to his neck, he honestly didn't feel all that bad. In fact, physically, he felt almost superhuman. Worries and stress were for someone with memories and control over their lives. And considering the man had accepted he had neither, life could only go up from here. Beneath him was a thick blanket of some synthetic fabric, which seemed the consistency and size of a large yoga mat. Observing his surroundings, the human realized quickly he was on board some type of vessel. The room around him was large and looked much like a hangar bay, with large, heavy gates on one end that formed an entire wall. Several boxes of storage seemed to rest along it, and above his head was a long, narrow crossing of metal railings and bridgework. The corner of the room was an elevator platform which seemed to have some type of piston beneath it. It was raised 10 feet above his head, just like the bridgework and railings. The air was thick and dense, but it didn't feel heavy or painful, and he took slow, shallow pulls of it into his lungs. That little air taken in seemed to make him hyper-observant, and his pupils dilated. He had never felt so alive, and his focus flowed from the scenery to his body. His muscles flexed as he curled his arm and repeatedly clenched his hand. The tiny crackling of his knuckles seemed to echo back at him in the strange atmosphere. Suddenly hunger struck him, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten. He quietly chuckled at that. It was technically true. On the opposing side with the elevator were several silver buckets. 8 of them, actually, each of which contained some type of organic material and one with water. The farthest 2 smelled horrible and looked even worse to the man's disgust. The middle 4 had no odor, but on closer inspection looked as dangerous as the previous were disgusting, with bright colors which seemed to scream poison. The man avoided them. Luck was with him for the final bucket, though. It contained something which was essentially a tasteless brown powder, which resembled sugar or salt in size and texture. As he sampled it cautiously, he felt his hunger grow. Still, he resisted and waited. Minutes passed, and he felt neither sick nor harmed. He could remember that waiting on such things was important, but he couldn't remember how he had learned it. After an hour of waiting, focused on shallow breaths, he succumbed to hunger in sudden desperation and fed himself by the mouthful, washing it down with careful swishes from the water bucket, before he rose again to explore the newest prison he had found himself in. The far floor of the opposing corner was a drainage gate, where the man shamelessly relieved himself. At least it wasn't in a glass bubble on show for all to see. It could have been worse. Beginning to pace the perimeter of the room, the man tried to read the script which covered the boxes and crates. The language never seemed to break, as it was just a long stream of patterned swirls which always spun into a spiral before breaking off at the center. Unable to make any sense of the strange text, he quickly grew bored, and eventually lay back on the synthetic mat, hands behind his head, cresting his neck to a comfortable angle as shallow breathing slowed. Content sleep overtook him. Siza had come to see the new ship beast as soon as he had finished his duties. Though the spawn of a shipmaster, he was not spoiled. In fact, by many standards, he was quite overworked. His body felt the drag of prolonged mental attention after a shift on the bridge. He had been observing the system function for the first 2 rotations after leaving orbit. It usually fell to his sister to do the second half, but she had been training to use the other modules, and was too busy to relieve him. With Ytale observing them, he could not bring himself to ask for a substitute. She expected much more of them now that his father was gone. Their father, and their wealth. He stared at the beast below as it lay on its mat. They had decontaminated that as well during its arrival, purchased used from another trader which had bought a smaller beast than their previous. The price had been low, and Siza had come to the conclusion that the trader's beast must have died on the mat in some disgusting fashion. It mattered little to the creature below, though, which seemed to breathe so infrequently it almost looked dead anyways. According to the initial ship's scans, it was strong, but how strong hadn't been determined. It had a body similar to his own, but much denser. Calcium content of its bones was higher than anything Siza had ever seen, and it had a tremendous muscular system laid upon it. The beast had certainly come from a high-gravity world of some kind. It was simply impossible to achieve such density and strength without it. He would need to remember to turn the cargo hold on a higher artificial limit in the future, so the beast didn't deteriorate over time. Its breathing quickened suddenly from below, and its strange lips moved. Barks of air erupted from it, and it sat up in shock, 5-digit hands grasping at the hair which covered the beast's skull. It seemed to rock back and forth in a small ball as it continued to wheeze. Siza wasn't sure what to make of the behavior, but he was glad the creature was far down below. It might not look as fierce as some ship beasts, but it was intimidating in its own way. As his tail coiled through the air, its light fur caught a shift in the air of the walkway, which announced his sister's arrival. His greeting set out in the traditional tones reserved for a fellow spawn, held only with slight sarcasm laced into the melody. They had been more prone to arguments recently, and Siza was beginning to give back when the opportunities presented him, especially when his mother wasn't there to notice. As Sonat approached, her blue eyes met his as she sang back her greeting, which contained more than a lick of pompous grace. Sonat was beautiful, in a way only some could ever hope to be. She had inherited only the best traits from her elders, and learned skills and speeds that made Siza frustrated at just a mention. He wasn't jealous, but he despised the constant comparisons. Compared to her, he was a simpleton who had to run just to keep up with her shadow. But run he would. "I'm glad to see you've come to keep more intelligent company," she laughed as she passed him to lean against the rail on his left. "I'm sure the beast can teach you many useful skills you wouldn't learn elsewhere." Her mocking voice lifted with an amused underscore as her tail flicked his nose. "You certainly need the help if you plan on assisting with the duties in the future. Mother almost threw a fit getting them vented." Siza groaned at the image. He had known he had forgotten to do something before he left the bridge, but hadn't been able to figure out what. "Is the shipmaster angry with me?" His song held to the formal tones despite the irritation of her presence. "No," her voice softened slightly. "I think Father used to forget the same. That was what upset her more than anything." Her song was quiet now. "You know, this might be our last journey on the ship, Siza. If the trades are bad, we're going to be grounded." He knew. He knew all too well. To lose a shipmaster was a tragic thing, but it was also economically crippling. Ytale had risen up despite her grieving to take over his father's duties, but trade was a business managed by trust, and his father's contacts did not know her. During the cycle after his death, many of the crew had left to support stronger ships with better offers. The ones who remained were loyal, but less crew meant less jobs, which had meant less maintenance. If it fell any further into disrepair, they would no longer be safe to fly, and that meant returning to life on the surface. Siza had never known life on the surface. He didn't like the thought of it one bit, either. This ship was his home. The trade ship had been taking the longest routes with the most expensive cargo, so as not to stress the hull with frequent deceleration at system checkpoints, which littered the shorter paths of trade. His mother had been taking tremendous risk in doing so, but so far it had kept them from falling further. Their descent to ruin had almost taken them, and through stubbornness alone Ytale had kept them afloat, if just barely. The purchase of the beast below had been uncharacteristic of her, especially considering the way the last one had gone. Certainly it was tradition, and of course it was considered good luck to fly on a trade vessel with a ship beast, but they were an expense. Siza knew they could afford few of those. In the early days of trade, these loyal ship beasts had offered true protection from raiders and pirates, and almost every trade ship had them. Now, in more peaceful times, only the true traders still had a beast of their own. It was a statement, and shipmasters were expected to keep theirs close at hand when negotiating. Staring at the beast below, Siza could understand her gamble. Perhaps with a ship beast at her side, she could appear in better standing and obtain better offers in the future. Perhaps she had invested in something which she could take with them in the chance that they were grounded at the next port. A stranded shipmaster and her spawn without a crew would not last long on the surface of an unfamiliar planet, especially if their hosts were carnivorous. His tail curled anxiously, and he turned to Sanat to find his sister with the same posture. She too had come to unpleasant conclusions, orbiting the presence of the creature below them, and what it represented for their future. Time passed strangely on the ship, and he assumed much of that could be attributed to crushing boredom. Easily a week or more had passed, and he was still in the cargo hold of the ship, with his only entertainment pacing in circles, exercising, or sleeping on his strange yet surprisingly comfortable mat. He slept a lot, but was growing wary of it. Nightmares kept striking him. Terrors he couldn't explain based off of fragmented memories his subconscious just couldn't stop grasping at. Waking up afraid with a headache was not pleasant. Every so often, the singing aliens would lower a silver bucket of the food he had come to refer to affectionately as dirt. Every so often, they would come to retrieve it. In fact, the aliens would pay him little attention at all besides occasionally stopping to stare when they thought he was sleeping. He was beginning to recognize a certain few, though. His repeat visitors. The two smaller beings that had been there during the event of his collaring often visited, and spoke in hushed songs at the railing of the walkway. Their elder with the scaled cloak had not yet appeared, though, which worried him slightly. That one had hurt him with the collar, and he was fairly certain she might do it again. That pain was something he would rather not experience. The other he had come to recognize was the highlight of his days or nights. He was generalizing now, but of the repeating schedule of time the crew followed, she was the highlight. During the quiet period of the ship activity, when the traffic over the bridge work dropped to 0, she would seem to slink in. He wasn't sure exactly what to make of her, other than curious. But she offered him more than any other creature had. Conversation. It was completely one-sided, of course. He couldn't speak a word, and he understood nothing she said. But it was comforting to hear her song-like speech, a peaceful melody that reminded him of music he couldn't quite piece together in detail. He knew he had liked it, though, and for that simple reason he had come to like her, or it. He wasn't really sure if they had genders. It dressed in a white fabric, unlike a majority of the crew, and had light green eyes which would glow in the dim lighting during the quiet period. Their solid hue had unnerved him at first, but now they were familiar, and consistent as the melodies that floated through the large room. Emotion was attached to every note, and he often felt as if he could see them as he focused on the sounds. Like colors or waves, the alien melody often lured him to a peaceful sleep where nothing else mattered. He sometimes thought his dreams were of home. All right, that's book 2. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. If you have not already, please feel free to check out the Patreon link in the description down below. We've got 15 now, and we are past my first initial goal. We got to $100, you guys, and I cannot thank you enough for your support. I've got 2 more goals on there now. They're much bigger than 100. One's $2 million. No, no, one's 500 and the other's 1,000. If I get to 1,000, I can basically work part-time, and I can devote a lot more time and attention to this. If I get to 500, I can at the very least get new equipment and stuff like that, and really start adding to this situation. But and if you don't know what I just did there, that's fine, because I'm streaming and you shouldn't be able to see that unless you're watching my stream. I just motioned to the back of me, which contains my quote-unquote studio. So anyway, guys, thank you so much again for listening, and I will see you in the next one. All right, bye.